daylight, anything can happen. Can't hardly wait to see what's next. I wanna face this world with wonder and excitement. Face every challenge, every test. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will get crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Can't hold me back now, I'm gonna fly. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Walk through the valley, walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Can't hold me back now, I'm gonna fly. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. I wanna live each day like anything can happen. Can't hardly wait to see what's next. I wanna face this world with wonder and excitement. Face every challenge, every day. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will get crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will get crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Can't hold me back now, I'm gonna fly. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Your mercies every single day. We glorify and we worship you, God. We come to you with humble hearts. We are the potter and we are the clay, God. May you shape us as you see fit, God. May I every day glorify your name. Holy Spirit, we welcome you into this place to talk to us, to move within us. Let the king of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he's my song. Let the king of my heart be the shadow where I hide, ransom for my life. Oh, he's my song. You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Let the king of my heart be the wind inside my sail, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he's my song. Let the king of my heart be the fire inside my wings, the echo of my days. Oh, he's my song. You are good, good. Oh, 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 you are You're never gonna let me down. 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 You are good,
praise you, God. We thank you for this incredible promise you give us, God. For all that you do in our lives. Every single day, even when we don't realize it, God. Thank you. You're so good.
Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Bring me melody. Mold me and fill me, Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Bring me melody, mold me and fill me, Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, come fall afresh on me. Come wake me from my sleep. Love your glory now and reign. Spirit, come and fill this place. Let your glory now and reign. Spirit of the living God, come fall afresh on me. Come wake me from my sleep. Blow through the caverns of my soul, pouring me to overflow. Spirit of the living God, come fall afresh on me. Come wake me from my sleep. Blow through the caverns of my soul, pouring me to overflow. To overflow. Thank you, Lord. Come and fill this place, God. Be in our every praise. Be in every hallelujah. Spirit, come and fill this place. Let your glory now and reign. Spirit, come and fill this place. Let your glory now and reign. Really, as a kid in each one of us, even though, well, there are some kids from here, but anyways, besides that, we like singing, songs that remind us of childhood days, I guess. Maybe this doesn't remind you, all of you, of childhood days, but I remember Daniel was saying about how he knows his song differently. Maybe he'll sing that for us some week. But anyways, if you know the song, sing along. If you don't know the song, it's a very simple song. Yeah. And if you know it in different languages, please feel free to sing it in your language. There's no one like Jesus.
been going through various stories of people in the, at least a little more recent past, who have lived changed lives that have changed other people's lives. Seeing what God has done and how His Word that was written thousands of years ago continues to affect people's lives more recently. And so we've looked at some that are a little more well-known names, the Booths that helped to start the Salvation Army, or Corrie ten Boom and her family. We also looked at one that probably very few people knew, and that was Elder Charles Bowles. And this week we're going to look at another family that I wonder how many people know their names or not. I didn't recognize the name at first. But first to say, I'm glad to be back. This last week, my family and I were traveling, and that included the grandparents as well. We were traveling around through Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, and Germany, and so I got to see some of these. But since we focused in Czech Republic, I got to speak at the church of a friend there last Sunday. I thought it would be interesting to look at the life of faith from a family that was from the Czech Republic. So today we're looking at a Czech family known as the Bendas. And that's been keeping with our B thing of Booth, Bohm, Bowles, and now Bendas. It hasn't been completely intentional, but I kind of like it. I like alliteration. So we'll look at their lives, but also see how that kind of interacts with some of the things from the Bible, and just what are the lessons that we can learn from them. Both Václav and Camilla were born in 1946, so just after World War II. But they grew up, and everything that they knew about was a communist state at the time, Czech Republic. Because they were born in 46, but then in early 1948, there was a military coup, and so the communist regime took over in Czechoslovakia at the time. So they grew up under that kind of system. That's all that they had lived. Both of their parents were lawyers. One of their fathers was a constitutional lawyer, which I wonder how that went for him, seeing the communism switch. So there's a good chance that their families weren't ones that were especially prone towards liking the new regime. Both of them became mathematicians and studied mathematics. That's where they met each other. How many people think, I know where I'm going to find my new husband. I'm going to go to the math department right now. That's just, somehow that worked for them. So they both met as mathematicians, and both were devout Catholics, which was strange even before the communist regime came in, but then especially once the communists were in control of there, part of the communist agenda was no religion whatsoever. So they had this faith that is already part of their lives as they're growing up, going to school. Now, the late 40s and early 50s weren't necessarily the easiest time to be living in the Czech Republic, and they had to decide whether or not they would take certain risks. And so a first lesson that we learned from them, I think, is to take the risk to resist the popular culture of what's going on. In part, it was, oh, well, a lot of people wanted to emigrate if they could to get out of the country because they knew it was going to be a difficult time. And for various reasons, their family decided to stay. And instead of running away from the problem, to try to work to be solutions in their culture, which we'll talk about a little more. But the choice to stay sometimes was hard. So in the early 60s, or mid-60s, there is the Prague Spring, they called it, where a group of people were now starting to kind of push back against the communist government. And that was in Czech Republic. And the Soviet Union said, that's not going to happen. And so they sent in the military and sort of did a hostile takeover of communists taking over communists. And so there's this even stronger push of we need to be even more communist, even more socialist. And since he was unwilling to sign a paper that would say, I'm joining the Communist Party, his career in mathematics and academics ended. He lost his job, as did many people at that time. If you weren't willing to go along with the party line, you were kicked out of your job. It made it harder then for you to be a part of lots of things. And he knew that that was coming. In the 1970s, when this was even getting stronger and stronger, Václav said, the conflict with the state into which I've entered will be long, exhausting, and by all human standards, hopeless. In this country, this means that my whole family, down to the third generation, will also be brought into the conflict, together with all my friends who are not quick enough to disown me publicly. He knew going into it that, humanly speaking, there was no way that they would solve the problem. And he also knew that this wasn't just affecting him, it was affecting his family, but they were willing to risk that, to resist something that they believed was wrong. Especially that people weren't allowed to practice their faith. So there was these two different parts of the 40s and 50s where it was tough when communism just came in, and then it loosened up, and then it got stricter again. And it was interesting, one of the stories that Camilla shared, that in their household, they became known as this welcoming household, and every now and again, for people who were emigrating, that were getting out of the country, they would sell all their things and then have like a going away party. And they had that going away party at the house of the Bendas. And she said during one of those parties, there were people who had been part of the revolution of the late 40s and 50s that wanted the Czech socialist government, and that were proud of what they'd done. But then now that there was sort of the Soviet socialist government that had taken over, they said, oh, things are so horrible, families are being broken up, all these horrible things are happening. And the person who was leaving the country said, no, wait a second. That's not true, that is bad now. Families were being split up back in the 40s and 50s, part of what you were a part of. And they started telling all of these stories of things that had happened. And the people that had been part of the sort of ruling party had no idea. My God, what? We didn't know. No, it couldn't have been. And Camilla said, even listening to my friends speak, you can tell that they weren't really apologetic. They still thought that what they had built was good, and it was only now the second wave of communism that was making it bad for other people. And it's interesting to see how when we're the ones who are in the majority population, we think, oh, everything is good. Can't be bad for these others. When in reality, there was fight on both sides. And as we read today, this shouldn't be a surprise that some people see the world differently, or Camilla said, as they talked about it seemed like people were talking about different worlds. Have you ever had that when you're in a conversation with people about, oh, how good is the Netherlands, since we all live here? Or Belgium, like, oh, yeah, this is such a great land, it's so wonderful, and then you have other people like, oh, it's so not nice, and it sounds like they're talking about two different worlds. It's been really interesting to me, especially with just the city of Maastricht, where we are right now, to have people that are like, the people of Maastricht, they're some of the nicest people. They're so great, they're so much friendlier than they are up in Amsterdam. And then the next person that walks up to me, Amsterdam, they're so nice, but Maastricht, they're really hard. They're not nice to me at all, they're not friendly. And it sounds like they're talking about two different places, and they're the same city. It's often who you come into contact with. But since they knew that there were these different worlds, Václav and Camilla decided that they wanted to get involved with the resistance movement. And so in 1977, they had 5 kids at the time, Václav signed what they called the Charter 77, because it was 1977. And it was people who wrote a charter that said the government needs to live up to what it said it would do. There were certain things that the government had signed on to, certain conventions, and say, look, these are the freedoms that we should have according to what you said. These are all of that. And Václav got into writing more and more. And he would write pamphlets, or what they called samizdat, that they would self-publish, because the communist government wouldn't allow them to just disseminate anything. They wouldn't be like, oh, I write down I don't like the communist government, you take that to a printer, and the printer would say, no, you can't do that. So they would self-publish. One man, Vladimir Bukovsky, said of the samizdat, these self-published things, I write it myself, edit it myself, censor it myself, publish it myself, distribute it myself, and spend jail time for it myself. And that's what happened often. So he wrote this one called Parallel Polis that became well known, or like Parallel Society. And it follows, even though he doesn't reference Jesus in that, it follows this idea of living in the world, but not being of the world. And he says, a parallel society, we live in this communist society that we're in, but we don't have to live like that society. And so what we need to do is build up our own structures for art, for education, our own media and printing outlets, our own political government structure that also interacts with foreign policy. And let's set up our own foreign policy things. Let's set up our own economics and finance things. For any of you who are interested in Bitcoin and some of those, a lot of the people today who are interested in Bitcoin are interested in some of his parallel Paulist ideas. It's, let's create some of our own separate culture. And if you read through the New Testament, even further on, and see like Paul's writings and Peter's writings, and how they talk about even just the family structure at the time, it's this different one of saying, okay, you might use the same terms that the people around you use, husband, wife, parent, child, but how that's supposed to be in this Christian culture is different. It's an upside down kingdom. It's different than the way other people treat that. So he was trying to write these ideas of how do we live differently? Even though we live in this culture, how do we be something different? The Charter 77 that he was a part of, this group, tried to include diversity in it, and so they would have 3 spokespeople at one time. One of those would be someone who was of a faith, religious background. One of those that was more like the artsy music type person, because that was also suppressed during the communist regime. And then the third one would be someone who was from the socialist group that was now kind of kicked out of power after the late 60s, the Prague Spring, so that they had these different ideas because they didn't want it to just be under one. And Václav Benda was the faith guy. He was chosen as one of the 3 spokesmen. And in 1978, the family just started getting more and more pressure. Another thing that we can learn from them is to start at home. Use your home to be that new symbol of what a different culture can be like, of what God's kingdom culture can be like. So Václav and Camilla were approached by sort of the socialist committee of their just apartment building that said, to celebrate when there was the communist coup, we're going to all put the Soviet flag outside of our window. And Václav and Camilla said, we're not hanging that flag out of our door. No. And they said, even though plenty of other people in the apartment building agreed with them and said, well, no, we're not happy about it, they had to make that choice of, do we fly the flag or not? Because it wasn't just, do you fly it? People who weren't flying the flag, it affected their families. And the Benda's children didn't get to have some of the educational options that they wanted. When they would apply to a school and say, I want to be a part of this program, they wouldn't get it because their family was resisting the culture. And so some people would choose, well, if I fly the flag outside, I just close the windows, so what? It doesn't matter. But for Václav and Camilla, it did matter because they said, we want to teach our children to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong. Camilla said, the most dangerous thing is when you stop distinguishing between what is right and what is wrong. And a child learns to lie automatically without even realizing he's telling a lie. When we teach our children to just go along with the culture and just do whatever they say, to just sort of nod, to just, oh yeah, sure, okay, whatever. Sometimes we teach them to lie without even realizing that they're telling a lie because you just expect that. So because of those sorts of things, being the spokesman for Charter 77, Václav was thrown in jail. And Camilla was left at home with 6 children now, raising 6 children for 4 years without her husband. But she made sure that she prayed every day with the kids, and she read to them for 2 hours every day. She said, I was never good at playing with the children, so I read to them. And that worked for me. One of the authors said, well, maybe it was because she was a mathematician. I think that's sad, because I like math and I like to play with children, but if you're a math person and you just prefer to read, that's okay. But I love how Camilla was just very much herself. She said, this is what I can do well. I want to invest in my children. I want to spend time with them, and I'm investing our faith. We're praying together, and we're reading together. They said that a favorite book of the family, or a favorite series, was the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They said it was for obvious reasons, because they felt like they were the hobbits, and because living in this communist regime, they knew that Mordor was real. For those of you who don't know the story, hobbits are little people, and Mordor is this evil empire. And they knew that evil was real. They couldn't just hide and say, oh, everyone's really good on the inside. They knew that evil things happened. They knew that people got thrown in jail, people got beaten, people got tortured, people were killed, people just disappeared. But she tried to, within the house, build up this loving, welcoming atmosphere. Their family has now about 10,000 books, so they had plenty of books to be reading in their 2 hours a day. But even after Václav was allowed out of prison, he was in prison for 4 years, his house was repeatedly ransacked. Police would just come in and do a raid. For at least 13 different times over the next 11 years, he was put on house arrest. Their house was bugged, they knew that. One time, they were threatened with the disappearance of one of their children. Their children were kept from the studies of their choice. For 8 years, Václav wasn't allowed to own a phone. And all that because he was still willing to resist. He became a spokesman again for Chapter 77. But it was funny how they worked with the children, because he said that the children decided that the police raids became a welcome adventure. Said, oh, our kids, they loved playing certain games. One game we called being unemployed, and one was belonging to the charter. But instead of this being this horrible situation where they just live in bleak darkness, their house was a place of joy and of fun, because they wanted to teach their children that when you live in truth, you live with an unchained soul. The more you have to lie, the more bound you feel. But when you can live with truth, you can live with joy, knowing that you don't have to be hiding something. They didn't have to hide who they were. One of Václav's pamphlets was about family, and he said that several gifts were involved with just being part of family, but the final gift demonstrated in family fellowship is the dignity and unique role of the individual. In practically all other social roles, we are replaceable and can be relieved of them, whether rightly or wrongly. However, such a cold calculation of justice does not reign between husband and wife, between children and parents, but rather the law of love. Those of you who read things like Romans or some of Paul's writings, the law of love is brought up often and often. That in a family, it's not just like, oh, well, we don't need you, one too many, like sometimes happens at work. Or like sometimes happens in all these other clubs. Oh, sorry, we already got too many guys on the basketball team, no one can join. Or in the football club, or in the car, sorry, you can't go along. In a family, no, everyone has to be a part. And so they enlarged their idea of family. So it wasn't just that they started at home with their kids, but they shared their home with people. Just like we saw with the Ten Bohm family a few weeks ago. That they made themselves a place where people enjoyed to come. There was music and there was reading. Even though they knew that their apartment was bugged, they continued to welcome people, even while Václav was in jail. Their son Philip later referred to the house as an island of freedom. That's how other people that were among their friends, they'd be like, oh, just going to your house is like an island of freedom. A place where we can just be ourselves, even though it's bugged and they said that what they would do is they would sit around in a circle and they could talk about anything. They'd talk about the weather, what else is going on. But they had little children's drawing pads, and they would write their messages down to one another on important topics that they couldn't say out loud. So, how's the weather today? It's sunny. Yeah, that's very nice. And then they would just continue passing those around. But they also had fun. They would have movie nights, monthly movie nights, that friends from church were invited over to. They said an obvious choice of one of the favorites was Casablanca, which, if you've seen it, is a World War II movie about resistance people. But they would chat, and people were welcomed in, and even friends that had just been interrogated or tortured by the secret police that were just down the street, a block away, after they were let out of being interrogated, would just come over to the house to have a place where it felt like freedom. To have a place where it just felt good to be there. And part of being Christians is showing hospitality, is being generous with our homes, with our lives, welcoming people into a feeling of security, a feeling of freedom, because we want to be those types of people. That as we're secure, it makes people feel more secure to be around us. more comfortable with us. As we live in the freedom that Christ gives, as we have the character, the fruit of the Holy Spirit, it makes it more welcoming. It makes it the type of place that people like to hang out even though they don't always know why. I have loved the fact that we've had some people in our church who don't speak English. We've had some older Dutch people who don't speak English well, that would then still come to the church and I'd ask, like, oh, why are they there? And they just say, I like the feel of it. You can tell this is family. You can tell this is welcoming. And so sharing your home is something they did well and something that I want us to continue to do well. There's something that becomes almost even sacred feeling about it. And their house, it got a reputation so that even now, if you walk by on the street, and Camilla still lives in the same house, there's a plaque that the Czech government has put there of their house. Their house is a special place to see. Some other people that would write about going there, it almost sounded like a pilgrimage. One man said, I'm not overstating it, that it feels like holy ground when you walk in there because of just the way that people live, who they are. The next thing is be part of the solution. Because it's one thing to be critical of a bad government. It's one thing to be like a backseat driver. Have you ever heard that term? Person who sits in the back and tells you how you're supposed to do it. But it's very different to be someone who's actually part of making up something new. And so in late 1989, there was what they called the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic. A group of students were doing a march, and that led to, over the next 2 weeks, the government crumbling and a new government being put in, including one of the Benda's close friends that became the president, one of the guys that he'd been in prison with and written things with. And so now that communism had fallen on the 50th anniversary of, or started on the 50th anniversary of when the Nazis had first stormed the universities of Prague years before, with very little bloodshed, it went peacefully, but then what? What do you do after, okay, the big enemy that felt like at their time, the big enemy is gone, but then you actually have to do something. You have to rebuild a society. And in his essays, Václav lamented that other people of faith, many of them, didn't take those steps into civil society, didn't get into helping to build up their country, and hadn't always taken part of the resistance before. And he said to follow Jesus' law and God's law, to love one's neighbor as one loves oneself, it had to be more than what he called pure spirituality. It had to be more than just spirituality. He says humility is good, prayer is good. But we need more than that to combat the evils that we're up against. We need to actually take part. We need to get off our butt and do something. The kind of lifestyle that we see in Jesus. Jesus went around doing good while he was teaching good and living it himself and staying consistently connected with the Father, praying and all of those things. And Benda had also seen that around the same time in Romania, same situation where the communist government had fallen, and that one, the beginning of the uproar, had to do with the pastor. So it was possible that people of faith could be involved with big changes in their country. And so some of the ways that they got involved, from 1991 to 1998, Václav became the head of a bureau for investigating the crimes that had been done by the officials in the country beforehand, of trying to shine light on where things had gone wrong. He also, in 1996, was elected to the Czech Senate. Camilla continued teaching. She taught logic. These weren't stupid people. Side note, Christians don't have to be stupid. If you run into that when you're in university, or other things like, oh, well, people believe in God, they must be dim-witted. People like the Bendas and so many others, I think, show that that's not true. She would lead philosophy seminars, and she was elected by the Czech Senate to a post of the inspector at the Office for Personal Data Protection. So like data protection, they're working with important things that are having to do with the freedom, the new freedom. that they have in their country. And it was something that they passed along. 3 of their children went into politics. So that's Camilla, that's their household. You see some of their books. And that's one of their sons. Václav is now dead. But that's one of their sons who has joined the Senate, is also part of that. Each of us is supposed to use the gift that we have. Not everyone is going to be a government official. That's true. Not everyone is a mathematician. I've learned that plenty fully. But use what you have and pass that love, that concern, and that willingness to love your neighbor, not just loving yourself. Pass that along to your children like they did. And the last lesson that I want us to learn from them is to remember to resist. And this is the thing that probably struck me the most. It's easy to get lazy. It's easy to think, well, the worst is past, the persecution is over, so everything is fine right now. But as Camilla continues to speak and she does interviews with people, she keeps pointing people to the fact that it can be tough to live as a Christian. And the Czech Republic is certainly that. Only 30% of the population says that they have any sort of religious belief, which is one of the lowest ones in Europe, if not the lowest. Any sort of religious belief. So that's Christian, but that's also other religions. Just 30%. And that number is going down faster. And just because people say they have religious belief, those that actually practice it is even lower. I read something, a person had written online about a vicar that went into a Czech school, a junior school he called it. And the vicar asked who the children thought Jesus was. And the responses he got back were things like Jesus was an extraterrestrial who visited planet Earth. Another said that Jesus was a mobile phone, because they had heard some sort of jargon clinging thing that said, "Go, Jesus, go," and they thought that that must be a telephone. So like, oh, Jesus, is that your mobile phone company? Another kid said, well, Jesus is just another name for a Christmas tree. They live in a country where even though it's not imposed from the outside to be against religion, it's now just part of the mentality of what's the importance of faith. One man in a Czech church was apparently speaking about Christianity and its importance, and he asked rhetorically, is Christianity boring, unimportant, and untrue? And one of the people in the back was whispering to their friend but didn't realize how well their voice carried. And he said, no, it's just embarrassing. It's part of the culture, honestly, a lot of European culture and other parts of the world. Yeah, what importance is there? And we need to not get sucked into the idea that faith is unimportant, or that that's something that we need to hide behind doors. Oh, don't talk about your faith out here. Camilla said it was almost easier back at that time. Traditional families, she said, now face threats that are harder to identify than those of the communist era. I mean, warning children about the secret police is one thing. In a way, it may be harder for today's parents to convince their children to be truly countercultural in an age of social media narcissism, gender confusion, online pornography, and credit card materialism. Someone has to teach children to distinguish between lies and the truth. Parents still need to pray with their children, read to them, and show them what it means to live a faithful life. As in the communist era, they may not be able to count on church leaders to speak out on dangerous subjects. It's always hard to face the problems of the age and to admit that they're real. There are always forces that try to prevent Christians from living Christian lives. I'll say that last line again. There are always forces that try to prevent Christians from living Christian lives. Remember to resist that. It's so easy to be like, we're in a free country. We can come together on a Sunday and live that out. But when the culture becomes to say that needs to be something that you keep just in your Sunday meeting behind your closed doors, just keep it to yourself, And yes, there are people who say you should actually just keep it to yourself. You don't even talk about that with your kids. Don't talk about that with other members of your family. Then we're living out something that's no better than the communist regime that they grew up with. So we need to continue to resist with what God has given to us. When I was asked last week to preach at the church, I said, is there anything that you'd want me to speak on? He said, well, we've been going through Ephesians. We're near the end of it, Ephesians 6, if you'd be interested. And so, if you know Ephesians 6, the last part of that includes what we call the armor of God. We're told to take up the full armor of God so that we can take our stand in the day of evil. Having done everything to stand firm then, with things like the belt of truth wrapped around our waist and the breastplate of righteousness in place. Having your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Taking up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all of the fiery arrows of the evil one. And put on the helmet of salvation. Take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And then he doesn't apply it to a specific piece of armor, but then he says, and pray. Pray for me. Pray for all those who are in need. Pray. And it's good for us to be reminded through things like that. And so that's what I've been reading with my son this week. Is I was like, okay, we're going to read the armor of God. And we were doing that every day to remind ourselves that we are in a type of war. He says our battle is not against flesh and blood. I'm not here to fight other people. I'm not here to bully people or badger people. That's not what we're here for. But we do have a very real enemy that is trying to make it hard for Christians to live a Jesus-like lifestyle. And so may we be reminded today to stand for truth, to live in truth, to live like Jesus did. A part of this world, but not living like this world. Let's pray.
Before I pray, I wanted to just say I've been very observant, knowing I was going to pray about missions, and I have seen missions happening all over this building this morning. Everywhere I looked, from the greeters to the sound people to the children's workers to anyone who spoke to any other person this morning, to the scriptures that were read, to the words that were said, to the music. Every place there's been a missional attitude. Even though the word mission hasn't come up, that attitude has been there to serve, and that's what missions is, to serve someone else to the glory of God, not to the glory of ourselves, not to necessarily to glorify the other person, but to glorify our Father. And I've seen it. And to that end, let's pray about our giving from here on forward. Father, we come and adore you. You made each one of us, and you made us all different and all very special, but you made us all with a purpose. And we invite you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to be with us, because we know that our praise, you inhabit our praise of you, and we praise you for who you are and how you work. We confess that we have sometimes missed the moment, missed the mark, missed the idea, missed the opportunity. And for that we confess, and we ask that you would show us where we have missed those things, and that we would see them and see them as your opportunity, not as a burden, not as a duty, but as a fabulous way to glorify you. We also bring to you our thanksgiving that you have made us, you've given us the tools, you've given us so many tools, and most of all, the death of Jesus Christ to save our souls and to give us a message to other ones how to save their souls, and of the Holy Spirit to encourage us. Those tools should be our daily bread of what is coming. And so we come to you asking, supplicating things that maybe we need to understand. Lord, I just ask that you would allow us to see the people who are around us, not blindly walk by them, but see them for those that need you in a missional way. And we ask for that you would give us them guidance and encouragement through our words, through our actions, sometimes through just being with them. I just ask you to give us the heart to want to be involved with others in a missional way. And that, Lord, we know means getting involved in the messiness of life. Sometimes the illness, the heartbreak, the problems that they deal with. But you, Lord, can give us that heart so that we don't resist and run away and go, I've got enough of those problems myself, I don't need more. But Lord, involve us, engage us. I just ask that you would give us each the guidance to know when and how to interact with people, when to speak, when to be quiet, when to hug, when to just give in some small way, or if to give it all, if it needs to be given all for you, Lord. Lord, I ask that you would give us the strength to be obedient in prayer and giving and time and service, whichever way that you ask. Obedience is our greatest gift back to you. And this morning, as we take the money, that we would either symbolically just lay down our lives, our wills, and our intentions as we would put the money in the basket, Lord, because we are giving back to you. We give back to no one else, just to you. Lord, we thank you for this joy of being here. And we just ask that you would be with us as we continue, as we walk out of this place in a missional way. In Jesus' name, amen.
When Matt asked if we would tell a story, it's kind of a long-term thing. When I met Rena and we were dating, obviously I wasn't going to say anything that turned her off. And she said one time that she'd like to be involved in missions when she got, along in life. And I grew up Catholic. I had no idea what missions meant. None. What do you think I said to her? You bet, babe. We'll do missions. And over the course of life, it wasn't until about the late 80s when I went to Belize. And that was my first mission trip ever out of the country. And a little 3-year-old black girl changed my life. And we've been involved in missions ever since. I want to tell you a story about how God can work sometimes. We've been married for 20 years. We've been married a lot longer than that now, but for 20 years. And we went on a cruise. We'd never gone on a cruise to the Western Caribbean. And we were sailing along, and one morning, the captain comes on and he says, ladies and gentlemen, if you look out to your left, that's the west coast of Cuba. Now remember, Cuba is still communist. This is in the 80s. Americans didn't get to go to Cuba. We weren't allowed to. Look at me, I'm pretty white. I don't like spicy foods. I've never lived around Hispanics. I have nothing in common with that culture from my background. And without blinking an eye, I looked at Rena and I said, babe, God just told me if I ever get a chance to go to Cuba, I have to go to Cuba. Had no idea why, no idea what. I'm going, that's pretty weird. We never talked about it again for years. 15 years later, she and I are in Mississippi, southern Mississippi, after the big hurricane that took out New Orleans, and some of you remember that. And we were helping a church plant, and the pastor of that church would drive out from New Orleans Baptist Seminary in Louisiana to come out to Mississippi to be their pastor on weekends. And he had asked if Rena and I would come and do a marriage seminar with their church. And we said, sure, why not? So we drove down and we were doing it. When I was getting finished, I was just kind of putting my stuff away. And Dr. Warren was maybe from me to that door away talking to some other people. And the people said, so where else do you have to travel yet this year, Dr. Warren? And he goes, well, this fall I'm going to Cuba. I stopped exactly what I was doing and walked over to him and said, did you just say Cuba? He said, yes. I said, can you take anybody? He said, yes. When I want to go. I didn't have to sit and pray about it. Didn't have to think about it. I hadn't thought about it for 15 years. God at one little point said, you need to go to Cuba. Hadn't heard it, and all of a sudden I hear a guy mention he's going to Cuba. I said, I want to go. He said, okay. So we took our daughter, Matthew's sister, and another friend of mine, and we went to Cuba. And I almost got thrown in jail. I won't tell the whole story, but I almost got thrown in jail because of something wrong that Dr. Warren did. But it was going to be my responsibility. They took my passport away, and I'm just sitting there. And my daughter says, what are we going to do now, Dad? And I said, you're going to fly home, and I'm going to pray like crazy, and we'll see what happens. And they finally gave me my passport, and I got to come back. When I got home, I said to Dr. Warren, so how many people have you taken? People like civilians, what I'm calling, you know, not the professors that taught at the seminary or anything like that, just people like you and I. I said, how many have you taken to Cuba? He said, you were the first one. I'm like, oh boy, but it's true. I've been there multiple times since, plan on going back in March. And now, as a result of that first trip, there are probably, from various churches in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, there's a trip going to Cuba every 6 weeks. And the gospel is exploding there. I have no idea what God's going to say to each of you. I have no idea how long it'll take to come to pass. But I do know in my life it took 15 years. And it was awesome. I'm just saying, being allowed to participate in the lives of others has been the single greatest blessing in my life. And that's missions. When I say that Rita and I want to spend time with each of you at a meal, as we as your host, even if it's going out to eat, like we got to take some of these guys 2 weeks ago out to eat, even if it's that, we're very serious about that. We love to get to know people. And yes, I'll just be honest, I want to influence you for a greater way in the gospel. Don't think it's for no reason, it's not. But that's our story of missions. We'll do missions as long as God. Oh, one last thing. I know you were running over, I'm sorry. I've gotten so old now, I don't know if there's anybody in here as old as I am, but I've gotten so old, and after traveling through all those missions, that I now look at each mission opportunity as a blessing that God would still choose to use us. I never look at, I'm going to help all you folks. I hope so. I'm just thrilled that God said, Bill, I'm going to let you and Rena go over and see once, and I'll see how I use you. Greatest blessing in my life. Because if he ever says he doesn't want to use me, I want to go home.
During the Trek Revolution, during the Velvet Revolution that they had, one of the ways that people showed that they were a part of it, or that they were supporting it, was they would jangle their keys. Like people would stand outside and they would jangle keys. Now, how many of you have keys this morning? So even if we don't have the old phones, a lot of us still have at least a key or some keys. And they said they would do it, and it was someone saying, the doors that have been closed need to be opened. That was part of the symbolism, was the things that have been shut off to the community, all of these things, ways that we've been held, locked in, those doors are opening up. They said it was also a way of telling the people who were like the evil regime at the time, say, it's time for you to go home now. You're not welcome here. And so I want us to get to do that, to stand and jingle some keys together before we sing a song, or as we do that. As that sort of a symbol as well. I don't know in your life, maybe you don't feel like you're unfree, like you're locked in or anything, but trust me, you know people who are. People who don't live in freedom in all different sorts of ways. And so, if you would stand with me, and sort of jingle your keys as a way of saying, God, I am committed to bringing freedom with me where I go. Because there are locked doors that need to be opened. And in a way, this can be, especially for those of you who, like, you're into spiritual warfare, this is sort of your way of saying, Satan, go home. The things that have been taking people's lives, it's not your place anymore. It's time for you to go home. As we sing this song, fall afresh on me. God, wake me up. And may this be a reminder to you. Every time that you pull out your keys, every time you lock your door in the morning, or unlock it when you come back, may it remind you of the freedom that Jesus Christ came to bring. And may it remind you that he wants to use you to be part of bringing that freedom. That we are ambassadors of Christ. Part of being an ambassador is you bring the message of that kingdom. And his kingdom is freedom.